Picture this. You're a young blue on a road trip with your portable DVD player, but you've just finished watching Laurel and Hardy: The Silent Years for the third time. Somehow this duo and their soundless funny moments have bored you, but you're just in time as your parents stop in the parking lot of a Walmart and you go inside. Your mom takes you to the movie aisle and says you can get one new movie for this road trip, and you're overwhelmed with joy and options. Shifting through the cases, you see it. The holy grail of animated superhero movies for kids. Next Avengers: Heroes of Tomorrow. To many of you, that story may fill you with nostalgia, dread, horror, or other adjectives, but to me, that was how I was introduced to one of my favorite childhood films, Next Avengers. Next Avengers has fundamentally influenced not just the type of content I enjoy, but who I am as a person, which may seem like an exaggeration, but I truly believe this movie helped cement my love for superheroes, which is a core part of my identity. So in this video, we will discuss the origins around this movie, the plot, some theories I have about it, how it transitioned into the comics, and also how it connects to the Alien franchise. Yes, the horror movies featuring the ultimate killing species connect back to a direct-to-DVD movie about the Avengers as kids. As stated, we're starting with how this movie came to be, which might start off as a familiar story for you Marvel movie fans. In the late 90s, Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy and sold off the film and movie rights to their most popular characters, leaving them with all of the nobodies. This saved the company, but it also made them realize what they were missing out on. So in 2004, Marvel entered into an 8-movie film deal with Lionsgate Studios. This deal was that Lionsgate would produce and distribute 8 animated direct-to-video movies in conjunction with Marvel Studios, and Marvel could back out if any of the sales were too low. However, that was not needed because all 8 movies were made. Ultimate Avengers 1 and 2 were based off of the recent Ultimate Universe Marvel had launched at the time and were made at the exact same time, resulting in Ultimate Avengers 2 releasing just 6 months after the first. After that came the Invincible Iron Man and Doctor Strange: Sorcerer Supreme, leading up to our subject of discussion, Next Avengers. But before we talk about this movie, I do want to quickly discuss the predecessors. Ultimate Avengers is the start of this series of movies, and it truly isn't great, but it is bearable. I do think it did a great job adapting the Ultimate Universe, but it's kind of a nothing movie, which becomes clear when watching the second Ultimate Avengers. Ultimate Avengers 2 is a genuine improvement than the film before, even having a genuine death. But overall, it's really odd. We established these characters without learning much about them except for Hulk and Captain America. There's a maybe romance between Cap and Black Widow, but it never feels natural and is barely ever realized. Tony Stark has an arc seemingly out of nowhere. Thor is a hippie, which is fun, but he is noticeably absent from both films. And then maybe the most interesting is Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne. Maybe I'm biased because I love Ant-Man, but these characters were the most consistent and also unbearable at times. Remember, this is the ultimate versions of these characters. So Hank Pym is a dick. He's so egotistical and gets angry at his wife for being concerned about him, which is probably because he's not used to being cared for. They don't have a good relationship and it's 100% his fault. And for that, these movies absolutely hate him. Giant Man spends so much of his time getting beat up, shot, yelled at or scowled, and even dies. In UA2, Hank becomes a better person, seemingly out of nowhere, and immediately dies because of it. It's a very strange take on the character, but it is better than what the Ultimate Comics did with him. That takes us to the third movie, which is the Invincible Iron Man, released just 1 year before the live-action film, but it is also an origin movie. This is probably the most interesting story of all the movies, but fumbles so hard in nearly everything else, especially the action. Now, even before the MCU popularized the whole interconnected universe thing, Marvel had actually been doing this with its animation and even some live-action shows. So it wouldn't be out of the question to assume this is the same for Iron Man and the Ultimate Avengers film. They even have the same voice actor. But I truly do not believe this is the case. The differences between these two characters are like Batman and Moon Knight, similar in certain ways but fundamentally different. Ultimate Avengers Tony specifically goes for glory and hides who he is, while Invincible Tony works in the shadows, creating his Iron Man Legion and trying to save his love. These two are just not the same. Finally, Doctor Strange isn't really relevant to anything going on in Next Avengers or even Ultimate Avengers, but it is by far the best movie of the four. The animation is good, action is fun, and the story barely ever bored me. It was a huge improvement from the others, and I actually think that if it was given a proper chance, could be better than the MCU film. So now we're at Next Avengers Heroes of Tomorrow, the 5th movie in the octology, released in 2008, and it's my favorite one. The plot of this movie is really simple. Ultron has taken over the world and killed the Avengers, leaving only the children of Captain America and Black Widow, Thor, Black Panther, and Giant Man and the Wasp. Tony Stark takes these kids to the Arctic and creates an artificial home for them while he raises them. During this time, he's also sending the Vision out on scouting missions and creating the Iron Avengers in order to try to fight Ultron. But ultimately, falls onto the kids to save the world, leading them to discover their 5th member, who is the son of Hawkeye. And at the end, they also find the Hulk. The children of this film are James Rogers, Azari T'Challa, Torrin Thor's daughter, Henry Pym Jr., and Francis Barton. Now this is your final chance to watch this film before I start talking about spoilers. Just go into it expecting a kids movie and you should be fine. So with that out of the way, let me quickly talk about the story more in depth, and then we can go on to the characters. The movie starts with the kids being extremely young, and Tony telling them a bedtime story that serves as exposition for the film. Tony introduces the Avengers one by one, and then talks about their battles before they eventually settle down and have kids. But sadly, Ultron rose up and defeated the Avengers, forcing them to send their kids away to a far away land. This is a very good way to introduce the movie, as it really fleshes out this world, but also gives the kids a way to look at their parents outside of the whole superhero aspect. Captain America isn't Captain America, but instead the soldier. Thor is the god. Wasp and Giant Man are the pixie and the giant. Vision is the ghost. Hawkeye is the archer, Black Widow is the spy, and Black Panther is the king. And of course, Iron Man is the knight. These are genius ways to turn this exposition into a bedtime story, which is introduced fairly naturally. This then takes us to the children growing up as teenagers in an artificial world that Tony has made in the Arctic. We meet the kids, get to know them, and then suddenly the alarm goes off and we find the Vision in horrible condition after getting caught spying on Ultron. Tony grabs Vision and brings him to his secret lab, but the kids follow him and sneak into his lab, where they discover the Iron Avengers. James lets his daddy issues show and accidentally activates them, which results in Ultron corrupting the robots and raiding the secret base. The kids are forced into a Quinjet with Vision's head, as it's the only undamaged part of his body. But before they leave, they realize that Tony is actually the knight from the story. These kids leave as Tony is defeated, and Vision tries to take the kids into the Savage Land, presumably to meet Kazar if he's there. But remember, Vision was damaged and his battery ran out, letting the kids unanimously decide to go confront Ultron and save Tony. Pym pilots the Quinjet to Ultron City, which is so creative, and they attack Ultron's forces, or more accurately, Torrin attacks without consulting the team about it, and the rest follow because they're not gonna let her die. During this fight, Torrin realizes she isn't as strong as she first thought, but luckily the team is saved by Hawkeye and the Scavengers. We then quickly learn the story of Francis Barton, and the kids try to recruit him, but Francis hits them with the grim reality that Tony is probably dead. A surprising character addition of Betty Ross reveals herself as one of the Scavengers and says that Tony is alive, resulting in the team breaking into Ultron's base. They find Tony, but of course this ends up being a trap, but thankfully Francis and the Scavengers come and rescue them. With Tony saved, Betty tells them about how the Hulk is still alive and where he's hidden. So the team, now with the addition of Francis, take an Ultron ship and go to the desert with Tony and Betty as well. This takes us to what I assume is the New Mexico desert, and Bruce has essentially become that one friend you get in college who pretends he's super chill and nonchalant, but can be triggered really easily. This team tries to recruit him to fight Ultron, but to no one's surprise, he refuses, making the kids decide to instead signal Ultron to their location and force the Hulk out, which is super messed up, by the way. He's very clearly traumatized by the Hulk, but in this case I do feel like the ends justify the means. Still a wild decision for the kids to be making. Before Ultron arrives, Torrin prays to Thor and gets her sword back, which she lost during the fight in Ultron City, giving her the confidence to fight once more. We then get to the big climax of the movie, which is the Next Avengers versus the Iron Avengers, and each kid fighting their respective parents. I don't need to tell you why this might be hell on these kids' mental health, but I will talk about one fight in particular later. After defeating the Iron Avengers and triggering the Hulk, Ultron arrives and the Hulk destroys him. The kids don't actually defeat Ultron. Hulk does. Except for one small thing. Hulk leaves and Tony tells them that Ultron is meant to survive, and we start to see his wires reconnecting. Torun then takes Ultron and throws him out into space at the cost of her own life. But before she dies, she is saved by her father. Thor tells her that he is proud of her and that he actually left her with the Avengers so she could learn humanity. Right after, he opens the doors to Asgard, but Torun refuses and says her family is down on Earth. Torun then returns with a new outfit and they end the movie with a sequel bait that never happens. This is just a brief overview and many details are left out. I promise you that you'll have a much better time watching the movie than this video summarizing it, but with that out of the way, let's talk about the characters. James is the son of Captain America and Black Widow. And of all the kids, he's definitely the main character of the movie. He's named after James Buchanan Barnes, aka Bucky, or as many of you know him as, the Winter Soldier. James is a slob, aloof, pessimistic, and a bit assertive, but he learns to become a leader throughout the film. He's also got a really cool hollow shield that he shield surfs with towards the end of the movie, and I'm just a sucker for shield surfing. James went through a few changes throughout his concept, usually between adding a cowl and debating what colors to make his jacket, but my favorite suit of his has to be this suit from early in the concept phase. I wish the torso was a jacket, but besides this, I think it's great. Black Widow doesn't get enough representation with James, and it would have been nice to see. She's rarely mentioned in this movie at all. In fact, Ultron scans James and literally only mentions Steve, so this movie just does not care for Natasha. Azari is the son of Black Panther, and the comics will later confirm his mother is Storm, which you can see in the movie due to his lightning powers. Azari is calculated, very honorable, and has a good moral compass, but he does often get into hijinks with Pym. He didn't go through many changes during the concept phase. Most of them was either giving him a mask or making him look more Panther-like, but something fun that was in just a single concept piece was giving Azari yellow lightning instead of blue. I definitely prefer the blue, but it's fun to see that wasn't an immediate choice. Henry Pym Jr. is the son of Giant Man and the Wasp. He's the youngest, which can be easily seen by how annoying he is, but he's also brilliant like his father and compassionate like his mother. Though interestingly, whenever it's not tech related, Pym is relatively stupid.
Hey, who's Clint Barton?
Maybe he was the knight, or the pixie.
The pixie was your mom, idiot.
Which makes sense given Hank is his father. As mentioned, he's very close to Azari, and their combined power really is something to be reckoned with. Pym has actually changed the most throughout production, as he was originally a girl. This makes a lot of sense if you take a step back, because first of all, they call him Pym. He's never once been mentioned by his first name. They also never use gendered pronouns for Pym. In fact, they barely use pronouns at all when referring to Pym. It's almost always just Pym. I do much prefer female Pym over the one we got. I think her designs are better, the red is nicer, and we'd get some more female characters. And also, being named Henry Pym isn't exactly ideal when this is your father, and especially when you're around this many robots. At the very least, this movie retcons that Tony made Ultron and not Hank, but I actually think this could have made a really interesting story for Pym to tackle, that his dad created the villain, because as it is, him and Azari really get the short end of the stick in terms of characters. Francis Barton is the coolest member of the team and the son of Hawkeye and Mockingbird. Francis is actually very interesting because he's the only member of the team who didn't grow up raised by Tony, but instead was raised by his father Clint until Ultron killed him. During that time, Francis became an archer, learned to lead a resistance group called the Scavengers, and essentially became a mini Clint. Besides being ripped straight from a YA novel, this actually makes Francis probably the most messed up character in this movie when you think about the logistics. The other four kids never knew their parents. They were taken by Tony and hidden before they could really form memories, so this movie is them getting closer to what their parents were like and trying to be like them. Pym and Azari don't necessarily follow this formula, but that's because they are very flat characters due to them just not being prioritized in the story, but that's very much the case for both James and Torun. James slowly learns to be like his father throughout this movie, and when we talk about Torun, you'll find that a major part of her character is trying to connect with her Asgardian heritage and praying to her father. That makes the scenes where they are fighting their robot parents more impactful, as they're getting over that need to be like their parents and becoming better. Obviously, they'll still have issues, but these fights are to prove themselves. Francis doesn't have any of that. Francis knew his father growing up. He was raised by his father. He's just a mini version of his father. He's hot-headed, butts heads with James just like their fathers did, and is even a flirt like Clint. Realizing that Francis had his dad in his life makes his fight with robot Hawkeye so much worse, because you now realize that this is a teenager fighting a robot that looks like his dad, who is controlled by Ultron, aka the guy who killed his dad. That's fucked up. The only kid that can even get close to this level of messed up is Pym fighting his robot dad, but in that case I doubt Tony told Pym about how weird Hank was with robots, and actually, Hank probably wasn't even a robot guy in this universe because Tony took his claim to fame here. Anyways, extremely dark moments in a children's movie that the writers probably didn't think about aside, I was just using this as an excuse to not show Hawkeye's concept art because they are not good. And the final character we will be discussing in depth is the second main character, Torunn, Thor's daughter. And you'll never guess who her father is. Torunn is the daughter of Thor and Sif, and these are very key parts of her character as she's the only character who outwardly shows her parental issues. While James has major daddy issues, he tries to keep that to himself, while Torunn actively changes herself to be more Asgardian. She speaks like an Asgardian and corrects herself when she doesn't.
Hey, I mean forsooth.
She acts like a god and even prays to her father. That's also another thing unique to Torunn, as Thor is alive. Before Ultron took over, Odin had died and Thor was summoned to Asgard in order to rule over it, but he left his daughter in the care of the Avengers, which we later find out was to give her humanity. The very same lesson that Thor had to learn after living like a god. A very sweet message, but also a dick move because the Avengers are dead and half the world has been taken over by Ultron. I get what he was going for, but Thor just comes off as a bum here who didn't want to raise his daughter. Torunn is probably the most round character here, as you can clearly identify a character arc and a clear structure to it. Torunn also went through quite a few changes during development, and something that bothered me even as a kid is the boob armor. I get this is a trope in just media in general, but it is a stupid one, and I have to say, of all the concept suits, she ended up with like the worst one. It is interesting seeing certain aspects that got lost through the process, like her cape and headpiece, but my favorite is this art which has her headpiece push her hair up to look like the wings of Thor's helmet. I get why they scrapped it because it'd be hard to animate, but that really is just so fun. Now that we've talked about the main five, I'm just going to talk a bit about some notes I wrote down while watching this movie. Tony speaks to an AI assistant named Jocasta.
Jocasta, adjust environmental controls in the hangar plus 2 therms.
This is actually really interesting because Jocasta was a creation of Ultron and has the brain patterns of Janet Van Dyne. She was created to be Ultron's wife, but she broke free and became a hero. Since this version of Ultron is made by Tony, I'm assuming Tony instead made Jocasta, and she's nothing more than his Jarvis stand-in for this movie. The Iron Widow has dreads. I assume this is because they wanted to give her long hair, but in a robot way, but it just looks like she has dreads. Wasp is the only Avenger to have multiple robot versions, which come out of Giant Man's mouth. The Iron Panther can literally become a panther, which is similar to Ultimate Avengers, where Black Panther could turn his head into a panther. Ultron's ships look like these tardigrades, or water bears as they're commonly known. Vision is apparently solar powered, but for most of the movie he's not in the sun, which is really funny to me. And finally, there's a trophy room Ultron has, but besides the main Avengers, nothing is recognizable, which is a real wasted opportunity to flesh out the world. Before talking about the comics, here's a little theory I have about this movie and if it still shares a universe. Basically, I came into this movie expecting all 8 films to be in the same universe, but that doesn't seem to be the case, especially not for this movie. Because if you can recall from earlier in this video, Hank Pym fucking died in Ultimate Avengers. And in this movie, Pym is the youngest kid. So logistically speaking, there's no possible way these two can occur in the same universe. But I was still determined to figure out if this movie could fit into an established Marvel media universe. As I mentioned, even before the MCU, Marvel still loved to connect their shows and movies. Sidebar real quick, Kevin Feige was a producer on Next Avengers, and I fully believe this is where the whole Tony Stark made Iron Man thing came from in Age of Ultron. I have no proof, but I will die on this hill. Anyways, I was able to find a connection, and it's probably the greatest connection I can find because it's the best Marvel show, Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes. This movie being a connection to that series makes a lot of sense as the Avengers lineups are the same. Ultron is also voiced by the same actor, the wonderful Tom Kane. And one of the writers for this movie, Christopher L. Yost, also was a writer on many episodes of Earth's Mightiest Heroes. The only main discrepancy I can really remember for this theory is that Hank did create Ultron in that show, but Tony helped. So with that, I can say I am about 87.3% sure that Next Avengers is connected to Earth's Mightiest Heroes. And if I'm wrong, now, the Next Avengers were created as original characters for the movie, with the exception of maybe Pym, but we'll talk about that later. Being an original character is not a bad thing. Many beloved characters have come from media adaptations. Barbara Gordon was only made to coincide with the Adam West Batman show. Phil Coulson was a household name for like 5 years, which still baffles me. And of course, Harley Quinn originated from Batman the Animated Show. With that in mind, the Next Avengers migrating over into the comics could be an extremely interesting and rather simple move to the comics. It could be similar to Batman Beyond, a TV show that made its way into the comics and incorporated itself into being a possible future of the main timeline, which fans love, including me. But Next Avengers didn't do that. Instead, we got 3 different universes involving this team, and that's just the start of the comic book nonsense. The Next Avengers first arrived in the pages of Avengers issue 1 from 2010. This was roughly 2 years after the movie and was a really interesting way to bring in the kids, but it was still kind of a mess. The first 2 pages are dedicated to the team defeating Immortus, the Master of Time, aka Kang, before he disappears, and we are left with this amazing team shot. This then transports us to the main timeline where we see the Avengers being reassembled. The weird thing about this version of the Next Avengers is that we're not actually going to see them again until issue 5, but we will see another version of the team in the very next issue. To sum up the story to make it make sense, in the future of the Children where Ultron wins and takes over the world, Kang decides that he needs to conquer it and goes to war with Ultron, pulling people from all across the time stream. However, every time he does this, it fails. And so he goes back, gets more soldiers, and repeats this, locked in a never-ending cycle of fighting that ultimately breaks all of time. This wreaks havoc on the Marvel Universe as everything everywhere is happening all at once. So Kang goes back in time and recruits the Avengers to help him. The Avengers then go forward in time and meet their kids, as well as old Tony, the Hulk, who they've actually changed into Maestro, which is really interesting since the Hulk in the movie is nowhere near Maestro levels. Old Tony briefs young Tony on the science of everything with this really cool, interesting timeline, and after he's done, time resets like Groundhog Day, or the superior Palm Springs, allowing the Avengers to go forward in time to talk to Ultron before the battle, and tell him to lose on purpose. We soon see the battle once more, and Ultron dies. This angers Kang and everyone involved since it was so easy, and this disappointment grows so much that Kang loses interest and gives up the land he just conquered. With the day saved, Immortus, aka Kang, who was aiding the Next Avengers to stop his younger self, turns on them, killing all of the adults, leading to the children defeating him before he vanished. Because of these time travel shenanigans, we get 2 versions of the team. The ones trapped in the infinite loop of Ultron and Kang fighting, and the ones from the timeline where Kang won and they defeated him later on. I thought this was a pretty fine story. It didn't blow me away and wasn't the greatest way to integrate the team into the comics, but it worked, and this version of the team would eventually reappear in Avengers World. But before we talk about that, I just want to discuss some details we learn about the Next Avengers from these 6 issues. First of all, the Avengers are not meant to know who their kids are and whose kids specifically, but in issue 2 they see an image of them and it's pretty clear which kid goes to which spectator, but assuming no one tells, Hawkeye and Thor both see that they have a child. Captain America is also present, but at the time this is Bucky Barnes in the suit, which is even more interesting because he gets to see the son of his father figure be named after him, which is really sweet. The Avengers also split into 2 teams, one that stays in the past and one that goes into the future, with the future team notably having Logan, Bucky, and Tony. As soon as they arrive in the future, Bucky tries to snipe Kang with a pistol, but he's stopped, not because killing is bad, but because they can't be sure that won't break time further. Old Iron Man's suit is a homage to Mark 1, which is especially highlighted by the fact that their base in the future Avengers is in a cave. Unfortunately, I cannot find a box of scraps. Then finally, the timeline old Tony creates has a bunch of references to it, such as Man Without Fear being Daredevil, but then we get to stuff that like spoils future events in the Marvel Universe, like Avengers Academy having a traitor and the old X-Men coming to the main universe. I have no clue if these are actually connected, as they are just vague enough, but I think it's really fun that this spoiled a few things in the future without being overt about it. These are just a few things I thought were fun, and if you want to read these issues, I do recommend it. It was fun for what it was, and not too hard to follow, which is what you can hope for when it comes to time-traveling Marvel comics. As previously mentioned, the next Avengers from the timeline where they defeated Kang reappear in Avengers World. But a little background information on this book is that it's not a traditional Avengers comic. In this, the Avengers and S.H.I.E.L.D. have teamed up to become equal partners, with S.H.I.E.L.D. detecting threats and the Avengers deploying the appropriate members of their team to deal with that situation, resulting in each issue connecting to a different story. Issue 1 establishes these stories as we see Black Widow, Falcon, Wolverine, and Shang-Chi deploy to stop riots in Madripoor. Hawkeye, Spider-Woman, Starbrand, and Night Mask investigate a literal ghost town in Italy, and the story will need to focus on Sunspot, Cannonball, and Smasher investigating AIM Island, which is experiencing technological innovations at a rapid pace. This story continues in issues 2, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, and all the stories converge in issue 14. Now issues 2, 5, and 6 aren't important to us as the next Avengers don't appear until issue 9. So to sum them up, Smasher, Sunspot, and Cannonball are captured and discover that AIM is communicating with the future in order to take over the current time. Because of this, Sunspot and Cannonball are sent into the future where they meet the next Avengers. Something I want to touch on before we continue the story of issue 9 is that the future we see is so interesting because it is nothing like we've seen before regarding these characters. In the movie and the 2 comic iterations of the team we've seen so far, all we really know is that Ultron took over and created his own Metal New York, and that there's also a desert that the Hulk lives in. Now the comics expand the universe slightly by including Tarantula for some reason, turning the Hulk into Maestro, and having Ultron be defeated by Kang in his time-traveling circus. Now from what I've seen in research, these next Avengers are the very same one from the universe where Kang quote-unquote defeats Ultron, but when Sunspot and Cannonball go into the future, the world they enter is completely uncharted territory. For one, they arrive in a place called Danvers City, and it seems to be a highly populated city for extraterrestrials. When Dum and Dee go into a bar, they learn that this is a port bar and by proxy a port city, meaning that Danvers City is a hotspot for spaceships. We also learn some history about this world, as apparently Earth has had 4 wars with the Chitauri race. But it gets a bit weirder and more surprising. In order to impress the barkeep, Cannonball blurts out that they defeated the evil Thanos, which angers all of the aliens. Apparently, in this timeline, Thanos was the greatest Avenger to ever live and fought the Kang Corps. Thanos being an Avenger isn't a new concept. It had a dedicated What If comic that came out a year after this issue, and the same can be said for the Kang Corps. Although there isn't a team called that, but there is the Council of Cross-Time Kangs, which many of you probably are familiar with due to the Ant-Man movie. We also get some history in terms of characters, specifically Jocasta and Taskmaster. Jocasta is the reason why the Burning Ball Boys are in the future to begin with, but she's gotten some upgrades, which is to be expected with androids. However, we also see Taskmaster in the future, and because his speech bubbles are displayed like normal and not robotic like Jocasta, we can assume this is the regular Taskmaster, meaning that there could be plenty of other characters we recognize kicking around in this time too. The story continues in issue 10, but every story continues in this issue, so it really just amounts to Cannonball and Sunspot returning to the present day with the next Avengers, and Maria Hill mind-wiping the bros to forget about everything they saw in the future, which is a shame because they won't remember that they made a great reference to Back to the Future 2, which actually did come true. We then get a full continuation of the story in issue 11, but they switched artists for this issue, and it is immensely obvious as the next Avengers look so different from issue 10. Like, this is not the same Hawkeye. You cannot convince me they're the same Hawkeye. Anyways, Character designs aside, the next Avengers reveal that AIM isn't just trying to gain control of the world, it's trying to end it. This results in the team being teleported to AIM Island, fighting the bad guys, and doing a fake-out defeat before Francis reveals that they were distracting them while they were uploading a future virus into their systems. With that, the team leaves as the buildings behind them explode and they regroup on the SHIELD helicarrier. That wraps up this storyline, but we do see the kids again in issue 14, where it's revealed that the team isn't going back to their time, but instead staying in the past in order to help, which is wonderful because they are never seen again. That's not entirely true, as we do see the team for the actual final time 2 pages later in this gorgeous overview of the 3 stories drawn by Marco Cecchetto and colored by Andres Mosa. I think we can classify this as non-canon for a few reasons, but mainly because the kids shouldn't be anywhere near their parents, and yet there they are. It is a real shame that the team doesn't show up again in the main universe, as they could have been something really special. Their personalities didn't really get to shine super well in either of the 2 stories that we've talked about, and I understand why, but it is still a little disappointing. I do have one more Next Avengers comic to discuss, but before we do that, I just want to quickly appreciate Marco Cecchetto's art. In Avengers World, he drew Clint amazingly. This should be hung up in a museum. I'm also sure you've all heard praises of his art on the 2019 Daredevil series, which I can only reinforce because it is just that good. But he also drew my favorite comic issue of all time, Venom issue 27.1. This is a genuinely beautiful issue, and not just the art, but the story as well. I hope to one day talk about this issue in depth, but for now, Flash Thompson is so beautiful. I think it is physically impossible for Cecchetto to not draw the main characters hot. Anyways, fawning over, we now get into the final appearance of any version of the Next Avengers, which is an alternate future like the others, but in a completely different way. This alternate universe has no designation, but can simply be identified as its very fun concept of what if Tony Stark became Sorcerer Supreme. This reality first appeared in All New X-Men issue 1, which came out around the same time as Avengers World, but the Next Avengers wouldn't actually make its appearance in this reality until Generations Iron Man and Ironheart in 2017. Unfortunately, there isn't really much to say about this team, but their personalities do shine through more than the other 2 stories, especially Pym and Azari. Pym is just annoying, if not more than usual, but that is on par for him. However, Azari does do something we've never seen him do before, and it's actively flirt with Ironheart. But Azari flirting is pretty new for this character, but it's not like we've actually seen him interact with any girls his age that isn't Tauren. I think this is a very interesting future for the team to inhabit because their origins must be completely changed, considering that around the time they would have been born, Tony Stark and many other heroes with the help of aliens and scientists would have solved basically everything. Because there's not a lot to say here, I will take this section to reveal something I couldn't naturally fit in, which is the hero names. Throughout this entire video, the only character to actually have a concrete hero identity was Francis, with him being Hawkeye. But through these 3 discussed universes, we have uncovered the names for Pym and Azari. Unfortunately, James remains just James, but I don't think it's out of the question for him to be Captain America later on. Tauren is Tauren as well, but that makes sense considering Thor's real name is Thor. And then unsurprisingly, Azari is Black Panther. This just generally makes sense, as that's a mantle passed down in the family, so naturally Azari would continue that tradition. However, Pym is a little more interesting, as he has quite a few options considering the legacy his parents have when it comes to titles. Though this won't really be surprising either, he went with Wasp. I think it's really sweet and makes a lot of sense, as his preferred method of using his powers does reflect his mother more than Hank. I'm super happy that they chose the name Wasp for Henry, because Janet just doesn't get enough love. But Wasp is not the only name that Henry Pym Jr. has ever had. As I said, Generations Iron Man and Ironheart was the last appearance of the Next Avengers team, but there have been separate instances of members of the team appearing afterwards, with one actually appearing before the movie. Henry Pym Jr. first appeared in A Next issue 12 from 1999. This character is from the MC2 universe, which is best known for Mayday Parker, aka Spider-Girl. This version of Pym is a villain named Big Man, which is hilarious. Hank had so many titles when he was a large character like Giant Man or Goliath, and they could have even done something like Titan, but no, he went with Big Man. Clearly he didn't get his mother's ability to name things. Now Big Man is a villain in conjunction with his twin sister Hope Pym, aka the Red Queen. However, Henry actually wasn't the evil twin, and when it came down to actually fighting the Avengers, he switched sides when he realized how truly terrifying Hope was. I wouldn't normally count this as a version of Pym, as he's a pretty different version of the character and can only be compared in name only. However, there is a reason he's here, which is because of James Rogers. The only alternate version of James appears in Amazing Spider-Man issue 74, which shows us an alternate version of MC2 where Mephisto conquered New York and slaughtered a large amount of heroes, and one of those heroes was James. Unlike Big Man, this is very clearly the same James from Next Avengers, and since this is an offshoot of MC2, it is entirely plausible that James Rogers also exists in MC2 alongside Pym. The only thing that can really disprove this is that Steve wasn't with anyone during the time he's seen in MC2, but that's not a huge deal breaker as comic relationships are messy in general. Sadly, I regret to inform you that Francis and Torrin do not have any appearances outside of Next Avengers. In fact, Clint tends to not have any kids in general, with the only notable child outside of Francis being Ashley Barton, aka Spider-Woman. She's from the Old Man Logan universe, so it shouldn't surprise you that her history is weird, like really weird. To prove it to you, her first codename was Spider-Bitch. That's not even the right species. As for Torrin, there really isn't anything for her. You can't even go off of appearances because a woman who is blonde and white is apparently very common when you're the daughter of this guy. Best I can say also stems from the MC2 universe with Thena, but like Hank Pym Jr., it definitely isn't the same character. We can't even make an argument due to the name being different. This leaves just Azari, and Azari has two counterparts which are also probably the coolest counterparts of the entire team. Starting with the one that appeared in 2015, this version of Azari comes from the Secret Wars version of Civil War. This universe is essentially what may have happened if Marvel's first Civil War never ended. We see a universe where Iron Man and Captain America kept fighting until they literally split America into two parts, the Iron and the Blue. Azari works for Captain America, and the only time he gets the spotlight is in issue 3, where he, Spider-Man, Clint Barton as Venom, and Elektra do a covert mission to steal supplies from Stark. This mission goes south and Elektra ends up dying, but they do complete their mission. We don't really get much from this version of Azari, but we do know a few things. Instead of lightning, he uses these dual purple hard light weapons, which look super cool, and he sides with the blue because T'Challa died during the earlier battles in Civil War. He's a really interesting character even with how little we see, but overall this story is super neat and I would love to make a video on it someday. And finally, the most recent version of Azari is the most important connection I could make for this video. In 2024, Azari appeared in Aliens vs. Avengers issue 1, connecting this whole video to the Alien franchise. He doesn't do much, in fact he's only appeared in issue 1 so far, but the series is still ongoing as I make this video, so there may be some more appearances of him, but I simply can't believe I can actually put a xenomorph in the thumbnail now and it's not clickbait. I've read the first 2 issues of this series, which is all that is out as of recording this, and it is pretty solid, especially since my only exposure to Alien is the Green Lantern crossover. This also makes me want to point out that Alien now joins the prestigious club of franchises that have crossed over with both DC and Marvel, so that's fun. I hope you guys enjoy this video. I had a lot of fun making it, and it was super nostalgic to look back on this very important thing from my childhood. I'm going to try to upload more long videos this year, considering I uploaded 0 in 2024, so I'm already doing better than that. Maybe in 2026 I'll get crazy and upload 2 videos, who knows. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe if you liked the video, and let me know your favorite animated Marvel movie because there's actually quite a few.